I think about when I was a child, and with my two younger sisters, we would play dress up by pulling out all of my mother's lovely 1950s sequin dresses and putting them on. And I just could have always hoped, but could have never imagined being able to sparkle. Feels really good. Of course, coming into this conference in anticipation of being able to speak in this session, I've been thinking for quite some time about what would be the appropriate things to address. And I've been on a roller coaster of highs and lows this year, working with the executive committee, with Nathan and Hiro, who I have grown to love and work very, very closely with. At times I've been bitter and I've been seething, and I've written and rewritten some really nasty talks to give tonight. And at times I've been in other happier places. But as my bio was read, and as you know something about my story, some like to see me talk about building temples and things like that. I'm not going to do that tonight, although I did have the opportunity to do that at the Affirmation Spring Conference in Phoenix during the month of May. And that can be found online if you want to see that talk. Giving that talk actually was very cathartic for me, in that for the first time in my experience in this journey, I was able to connect my experiences in my professional life with my experiences in my gender transition, my self-actualization, and then my movement towards living authentically. And as I stood and gave that address last month, I learned things about my journey that I had not understood before, that the dots started to connect in ways that were just incredibly special while I was standing there in front of the camera and the people and talking. And that changed me. And I decided that all of those angry talks that I was going to give and all of those emotions that I had inside, that wasn't what was needed. The divine influence came upon me, and I felt tonight that I want to share with you a love story. And the more I've thought about it and worked on it, I've realized how important it is that we recognize healthy, loving relationships, and that we, in Affirmation, affirm such. Indeed, the very second line of Affirmation's charter says, we affirm that gender and sexual diversity, including healthy, loving relationships expressing that diversity, can be consistent with and supported by the gospel of Jesus Christ. Our purpose as an organization is to support the broad diversity of healthy, loving relationships. And as I talk tonight about one such healthy, loving relationship, I could be a little concerned that I'm speaking about my own journey and situation, but it's the one that I know best, and since I'm speaking without notes, I need to be able to tell you a story that I know really well. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit of my journey to come to a place where I have found a healthy, loving relationship appropriate to my circumstances and situation. But I want to be able to allow you all to apply these principles, these thoughts, these kinds of experiences to your own lives. Some of you may be already in beautiful relationships. We heard from Rebecca and Melissa last night how wonderful their relationship is, even stronger now after Rebecca's transition. For others of us, that hasn't been the case. It's been a rockier road. Some of us may have lost our partner along the way due to illness or death or in my case, as I'll explain, separation and divorce. But my hope is, as I talk tonight about healthy, loving relationships, I can instill a desire for resiliency and hope that things can get better. So, first I have to give a little bit of background, catching up on where my story came from. As was mentioned, I was excommunicated from the church. It happened to be Pride Sunday in Salt Lake in 2017. So every year when I mark Pride, I remember that it's also the end of my membership in the LDS Church. Just after that time, Peggy Fletcher Stack in the Salt Lake Tribune interviewed me and ran an article. After leading LDS congregations, designing Mormon temples, this Utah dad is building a new life as a woman. I was really happy that this article came out on the front page of the Tribune, because I know for a fact, whoops, my slides disappeared. I know for a fact that the Salt Lake Tribune winds up on the desk of every managing director in the church office building, and my smiling face on Wednesday, July 17th, was sitting right there in front of them with that headline. I went through a very difficult time during those summer months of 2017, in that I had to grieve and mourn the loss of community and fellowship that I had worked diligently in all my adult life. And at that time, I decided it was appropriate to begin to share my journey, my story as an excommunicant. And I found myself at that time sitting in a very uncomfortable chair in John DeLynne's office in his home for 5 hours in front of an iPhone 7 camera, telling my story through my tears. I was in an extremely raw and vulnerable place. But I needed to start telling this story because I knew that others had traveled it and that others in the future might travel it. And I wanted to find those along that journey and to be able to share my story, and have learned very much about what it means to share one's story, how powerful that can be. So, sharing that story, moving forward and becoming public, actually helped me on a road. I'm going to back up for just a second, leave my teary-eyed face there. I spoke to Equality Utah's Q-Talks in, I think it was January of 2018, and talked about how the life that I had built by making all of these decisions to become the quote-unquote successful Mormon man that I was trying so hard to portray, that process and those life decisions built a stronger and stronger prison around me, in which the walls and the bars on the doors and the windows were literally built of the decisions and the commitments that I had made. And coming out and deciding that I needed to live authentically or perish caused me to have to take that prison apart and find my way out of it. And in doing so, I lost every aspect of my social, cultural, professional, ecclesiastical, spiritual world all came crumbling down, and losses were constant. And I found myself in 2017, rolling into 2018, in a state of almost constant loss of those things which I held dear. One night I was talking to Richard Osler in his front room of his house, and we kind of recounted all of those things that I had lost. And at that point, it was true that the only thing I had left was the old Ford Explorer that I drove during that entire time. And I still have it. The only thing that I have from before is my car. Unfortunately, and I'll say just this, even though my spouse of 32 years and I had been able to navigate the process of coming out and of even transitioning, and even my process to point of living authentically, we had navigated that together successfully for over 6 years of our marriage. At the point of my excommunication, it seemed to be the straw that broke the camel's back. She could live with me as a woman, but not as an excommunicant. And I don't fault her for that. And in fact, I've spoken with the church about the fact that rather than strengthening families, that process divided and broke my family. Now I can flip, now I can flip the right way. Now I can flip to this slide, which is the post that Josh and Laurie Lee made in January of 2018. Coincidentally, and I've shared this with them, when they came out in 2012 and began talking about how they were going to make their mixed orientation marriage work, was almost simultaneously when I had come out to my spouse and children, and we were committed to making our mixed identity marriage work as well. And with great coincidence, it was January of 2018 when my now former spouse and I began talking about divorce. And then this article came out that they produced that announced the end of their marriage. And I feel like we're walking in parallel universes with the weeds. But I read that article at the supper table in my little one-bedroom apartment in South Salt Lake that night that it came out. And I broke down and sobbed and sobbed and sobbed and mourned the loss. Mourned the loss of my marriage. And I realized that night, as I lay on my bed, having a real ugly cry, that, not little tears like these, but a real ugly cry, that I was alone and I was panicking and could have become suicidal. And it was the first time that that had happened, when I was alone in a home by myself, and it scared me. And so I immediately started my phone chain. I figured I'm going to call everybody that I can count on. And I called the person who was closest in distance to me, who happened to be my Relief Society president at the time in the Liberty Ward. And she fortunately answered the phone and told me I could come over. And I came over and I told her my whole sad story and sat on her couch and cried for several hours. And we played games and I cheered up somewhat, but that was a low point for me, in which I felt deeply the loss of marriage and family. As I mentioned, my marriage had failed despite trying to make it work for 6 years after coming out. And over the next several months, I began to recognize that I had never really been romantically loved as my authentic self. And the longer I lived alone, the more I missed simple human touch. Now, looking backwards from today, it was chronologically a very short period of time, so I must be a real wuss, because I know there are many in this room tonight who've lived alone a lot longer than I did. But it's not good for man to be alone, or me to be alone. I felt strongly that to be well and to be whole, I needed to have someone in my life that, if that were even possible, that could romantically and deeply love me, for who I am. Which brings me to Nancy. Late in March of last year, I was checking Facebook and I saw a notification that a gal by the name of Nancy LaVange Beeman had liked the lighthouse picture that I have on my Facebook wall. Of course, you get a little Facebook like right there, or love right there. This lighthouse has always been my background picture on my Facebook page because in York Beach, Maine, my grandparents, my mom and her family long owned a home there, and I spent all my childhood summers just down the road from this lighthouse in its shadow and playing on the coastline of the Atlantic there in southern Maine. This person loved my lighthouse on Facebook. I looked at her name and I thought, I wonder if that's the same person that I knew 40 years ago. And so I quickly stalked her on Facebook. Tell me you haven't done that before. Wow, this guy's cute. I think I'll stalk him and see what his relationship status is, right? So I stalked Nancy, and sure enough, she was the individual that I remembered meeting nearly 40 years before in 1980. When I joined the church in 1980 and went to a branch in central Massachusetts, her husband's family were members of that same branch. And she and her husband had just married, and I knew them. I knew the family quite well. So I wrote her a quick note, one of those larky things. It's like, yeah, this will never amount to anything, but I'm just going to write a quick note and say, hey, I think I know your husband's family. She wrote back and said, yes, you certainly do. and we began to chat. And I was kind of a little bit taken aback by the fact that we chatted long into the night that first night, and we chatted the next day and the next day and the next day. It was like constant chatter. And a couple days into that chatting, she said, my husband has just been told that his pancreatic cancer is terminal and that he has only months left to live. Her husband, John, was 62 at that time. I quickly realized why she was chatting with me. She was grieving and sorely feeling alone in a situation that would overwhelm and challenge the best of us. I responded to her, if you would like, I will be your visiting teacher, your virtual visiting teacher, because living 1,500 miles away, I couldn't make the visits, every month like you're supposed to. Notice that the term is visiting teacher. This was, yes, literally the week before Ministering Angel Sisters, or whatever they call it now. It became the new term. But she told me later that offer to be her virtual visiting teacher was the sweetest thing that she had ever heard. And to me, it was just simple, hey, I want you to know I'm here for you, and I'll walk with you as you go through this journey of losing your husband. As we talked about his process with his cancer and how it went from being something they were working with to something that ultimately was terminal, we discovered this little alignment of the stars, that the very day I left church employment, which marked the end of my old life as that person by that other name, was the same day that her husband received his initial diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, September 9th, 2016. My summary regarding that was the day that I began to live as Laurie was sadly the day that he began to die. That's not the only time all of these stars seem to have lined up for Nancy and myself. Next 5 or 6 weeks go by, and we talked a lot by phone and by text, And I did that virtual visiting teaching thing probably as well as any sister in the church, and grew to be very connected to helping her along each day. I've put up on the slide Sarah. Sarah was one of Nancy's granddaughters, 4 years old last year at the time that this occurred. I was doing something in my apartment early on a weekday morning. It was about May 15th, and the phone rang, and I saw that it was Nancy, and I got kind of, happy and excited. Oh, good, we get to talk a little bit more, like we hadn't talked within the last 12 hours. And I said, "Good morning," and she said, "It's not a good morning." I thought, oh crap, what happened? Little 4-year-old Sarah had been swimming with her sisters under Nancy's supervision in a neighbor's pool. And as she got them all out, all the kids out of the pool, took off their life vests and so forth, and were getting them all ready to cross the street and go back to the house, little Sarah, being the adventurer that she is, without her life jacket on, opened up the fence to the pool and went back to the pool and jumped in for one more swim, not knowing how to swim without a life preserver, but never having experienced that. She did what little kids do, face down, deep in the water. Her older sister, Molly, shouted to their grandmother, "Sarah's in the pool." Nancy ran and grabbed Sarah, plucked her out of the pool. She was blue, unresponsive, and not breathing. And as Nancy describes it, the Spirit took over, calmed her nerves, and reminded her everything she knew about CPR. And she worked with the child until paramedics were able to arrive, what must have seemed like years later. And they took over from there, and Sarah spent a night in ICU. It was touch and go for a while. My sense from Nancy's description is that she brought Sarah back to life and worked with her and stayed with her until she could get help. Note the slide says May 15th when that happened. Here's Sarah 2 days later. Now, why do I tell you the story of Sarah? It's an amazing and loving, happy and cool story that a little child came back from the brink of death and 2 days later looked as ready to go get in trouble again as she does in this picture. But it's also to illustrate that after Nancy and I had known each other less than 2 months, the first call she made after getting back to her house after this most unforgettable and traumatic life experience was to me. Not to her sisters, her mother, her dad, not to her neighbors or anyone else. She called me. And the more I thought about that afterwards and how rattled I was that she talked through me the whole experience, I realized that inadvertently or through my desire to help her, we had built a connection where I was her first line of defense. And there was a connection there that was deep and very profound. As it was getting closer to the time that her husband passed, ultimately last summer, I had talked with her about preparing end-of-life paperwork and all of the work that needs to go on in that matter. And I had just the year before done that work for my parents and getting all of their paperwork and accounts and all of those things put together for them. And I was simply trying to talk her through and say, these are all the things that need to be done. Have you done these things? And I could tell she was so rattled by what I was asking that, one, it hadn't been done, and two, she didn't have the wherewithal to bring it all together while he was still with us. And so we decided that I would go and spend several days with them in Kentucky, where they lived. So I flew out, and that also gave us the chance to meet each other in person. During that time where we were talking, and I was able to get all of the end-of-life paperwork and so forth prepared and got a lot of projects done on their house because her husband for almost 2 years had been unable to maintain anything. And so I found myself, fixing things that had, needed help. But she shared with me, I forgot to tell you the important part of how we met in the first place. Going back to that lighthouse slide, why did she love my lighthouse? Well, she told me, as I've mentioned on here, that she found me in March of 2018 after she watched all 5 hours of my Mormon Stories podcast with John DeLynn, crying her eyes out the entire time. She recognized that it was me, the same person that she'd known before. But she told me, I totally accept you for who you are. And she said, I fell in love with you while watching your podcast. Well, at that time, her husband was still downstairs. And when she said, I fell in love with you, for me, it was like the kind of love that two sisters have. And it felt very nice. But for me at that time, it wasn't more than that. But I did take the opportunity when I got back to Salt Lake to find John DeLynn and thank him for this interview that brought the two of us together. But I also told her at one point during that visit, as she expressed her feelings for me that I said we weren't going to talk about at that point, I also eventually told her, wherever you are, there will I call home. My feelings were starting to deepen as well. But I still lived in Salt Lake, and she lived in Kentucky. Now I want to talk to you just a moment about her husband, a fellow. Microphone. Oh, am I back on? Okay, good. It went out for just a minute. I could hear it in my ear. John was someone that I had known as a young person. I knew his family really well. Felt like an old friend to me when I went to their home and spent time talking with him. He was very, very sick at that point, and with only weeks left. When I come back to Salt Lake at the end of June, and with the deepening feelings that Nancy and I were experiencing for each other, Nancy had taken the opportunity to talk with John about the fact that she had feelings for me, and she wanted to know how he felt about me. And he said, I love Laurie Lee. I'm so grateful she's in our life. And when I learned of that, it brought me great joy at that kind of critical juncture. Several weeks later, I wrote him a letter. I felt impressed to write John a letter. And it was one of those things where I'm often moved by the Holy Spirit. I believe deeply in the divine assistance that comes through the Holy Ghost. And this was one of those experiences in writing this letter that I felt deeply pressed that I needed to write to John. And so I started composing this letter, and I was amazed and shocked at what I was putting down on paper and the things that I was saying that I should have had no business whatsoever writing to someone. A crux of that letter included this statement: John, you may be rest assured that Nancy will never be alone, nor fear, or have reason to lose hope during your absence. I finished the letter, and I did what Abraham Lincoln always did with some of his important letters. set it aside for a while and thought, I can't send that. I'm glad I wrote it. I'm glad I got it out of my mind, but I can't send that to him. About 3 hours later, I was tormented by the Spirit to send this stupid letter. And I did. I sent it to him, and I thought, I'm either creating enormous havoc or this is really the right thing to do. I said to him in that letter, all I hope to offer to you at this time is that peace of mind, and I give it to you with all of the love that I have in my heart. I was sincere in my feelings in that letter. About 3 days later, microphone's being weird. About 3 days later, John wrote back to me and said, I just want you to feel welcome here. You make this burden lighter, and I thank you for that. And those were the last words he and I ever exchanged. I received that on Tuesday, literally after he wrote that. I'm not sure, maybe one or two more times that he even left his bed. And he died Saturday evening. I think the key for him to be released was to know that his dear Nancy was going to be taken care of and was going to be okay. So, middle of July last year, I went back again for the memorial service. And after it was over, I should say before it occurred, between John's death and my arrival, Nancy had been inconsolable. Her children and family were all arriving, and they found her quite distraught and truly inconsolable. And some of the family were kind of confused or worried about my arrival and what it meant for this new person that they didn't know to be showing up in the middle of all of this. But she was adamant that I was to come and that I was invited and should be there. And what happened was quite interesting. Upon my arrival, she found peace. And I remember her oldest daughter the next day said, I don't know what it is between you and my mom, but the minute you arrived, she found relief. And it was that way through the rest of the week, as difficult as it was. After family had all gone home, leaving just the two of us left at the house, we started talking about what the future looked like. And that future included her inviting me to come and share the home in Kentucky. At that point in time, as her housemate, and she was clearly in mourning, and it wasn't the time to talk about feelings. Because things happened to be just right in my situation in Salt Lake to temporarily close my office and bring a halt to my practice and make a move, I was able to do that in August. And uprooted from 23 years of living in Utah and moved to Kentucky. Let me back up and just say a couple more things before I hit that slide. Over the next couple months, once I was there in the home, and this comes back to the loving, healthy relationships, the love story. Once her heart was healing from the grieving and the mourning, she discovered a connection to me that she said was as strong, if not stronger, than the connection she had with her husband of 38 years. She said, I've been married to a man for 38 years, and yet she felt an attraction to me that, and she, again, totally accepting me as female, that she found to be profound and real in her life, that also helped remind her that maybe she wasn't quite as heteronormative as she thought she was. That developed to a point where, without being too anxious about putting labels on each other, we generally consider each other to be pansexual. and able to fall in love with any person, regardless of gender, and that we're attracted to loving, beautiful people. And we found each other. She's often referred to the fact that our coming together, in her words, is a God thing or a Holy Ghosty thing. So I've adopted those terms. Part of my message here includes the notion that as I have been led by the Spirit to do other things in my life and to do the things which my resume now captures, always by the Spirit, the same Spirit led me to this relationship. It affirms to me that God was in this, and that the God that I trust, not the church, the institution, but the God that I trust affirms loving, healthy relationships. I recognize in this story that I've shared with you resilience, hope, and the affirmation that things can and do get better. There we are in our first selfie. Okay, I have complete permission to show these slides. Okay, I was ready to pull any of them that she didn't approve of. This was our first attempt to take a selfie. It was a joke because we're sitting on her bed, and yes, I still have my own bed. We're sitting on her bed trying to take this selfie. Neither of us had a bit of makeup on. It was late at night, and anyway, but I wanted to share it with you because it is the raw data, okay? It is the raw us. And I remember the first time I saw her picture, way before I thought anything could come of us. I thought she has the most loving look in her eyes when she gets her picture taken. And I thought, maybe someday I could be the beneficiary of somebody looking at me with that much love in their eyes, not realizing at that time that look, that love would actually be looking at me. I recognize in this story the influence of the God in whom I trust to guide my life by His Holy Spirit. And if it happened for me, it can happen for others. Oops, that slide looks pretty dark. Probably good because she really hates this picture. Anyway, that's at my parents' house. Yes, I took her to meet my parents. Isn't that cool? They love her as much as I do. It's really bizarre. She loves my dad more than any person I've ever met. They were like peas in a pod together. I should mention that Nancy is also from central Massachusetts, and if I'd lived 3 miles south of where I actually grew up, we'd have gone to high school together. That's the commonality we enjoy. Now, to those who would say that this represents a culture of evil and personal wickedness, don't we look wicked? To those who would denigrate our right to live fully and to pursue happiness, littlest grandchild. To those who teach our youth that it is somehow wrong to support gay marriage and transgender rights. You see the sign that says, love is love. I say, love is love. We affirm healthy, loving relationships. Love is love. Thank you.